This week on Bill Moyers' Journal.
One family traces the secrets of its past.
My ancestors' stomach for violence must have been extraordinary.
Powerful reminders of a painful legacy.
This terrible shadow began to fall back across Black life in America that effectively re-enslaved enormous numbers of people.
And possibilities of reconciliation.
Now, I see a tremendous change already in the Black community. My God, I mean, we are accepted. We are part of the system.
Stay tuned. Those photographs are from one of the most stunning new books you'll read this year, Slavery by Another Name. The author is Douglas Blackmon, the Atlanta bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. His articles on race, wealth, and other issues have been nominated for Pulitzer Prizes 4 times. His reporting on U.S. Steel and the company's use of forced labor was included in the 2003 edition of Best Business Stories. And his contribution to the Journal's coverage of Hurricane Katrina received a special headline award in 2006. Welcome.
Thank you.
This is truly the most remarkable piece of reporting I have read in a long time. I honestly cannot recommend it highly enough. What you report is that no sooner did the slave owners, businessmen of the South, lose the Civil War, then they turned around and in complicity with state and local governments and industry reinvented slavery by another name. And what was the result?
Well, the result was that by the time you got to the end of the 19th century, 25 or 30 years after the Civil War, the generation of slaves who'd been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and then the constitutional amendments that ended slavery legally, this generation of people who experienced authentic freedom in many respects, tough life, difficult, hard lives after the Civil War, but real freedom in which they voted, they participated in government.
They farmed.
They farmed. They carved out independent lives. But then this terrible shadow began to fall back across Black life in America that effectively re-enslaved enormous numbers of people. And what that was all about, what that was rooted in, was that the Southern economy, and in a way the American economy, was addicted to slavery, was addicted to forced labor, and the South could not resurrect itself. And so there was this incredible economic imperative to bring back coerced labor, and they did on a huge scale.
You say they did it by criminalizing Black life.
Well, and that was a charade, but the way that happened was that, of course, before the Civil War, there were slave codes, there were laws that governed the behavior of slaves, and that was the basis of laws, for instance, that made it where a slave had to have a written pass to leave their plantation and go and travel on an open road. Well, immediately after the Civil War, all the Southern states adopted a new set of laws that were then called Black Codes, and they essentially attempted to recreate the slave codes. Well, that was such an obvious effort to recreate slavery that the Union military leadership that was still in the South overruled all of that. Still, that didn't work. And by the time you get to the end of Reconstruction, all the Southern legislatures have gone back and passed laws that aren't called Black Codes, but essentially criminalize a whole array of activities that it was impossible for a poor Black farmer to avoid encountering in some way.
Such as?
Vagrancy. So vagrancy was a law that essentially, it simply, you were breaking the law if you couldn't prove at any given moment that you were employed. Well, in a world in which there were no pay stubs, it was impossible to prove you were employed. The only way you could prove employment was if some man who owned land would vouch for you and say he works for me. And of course, none of these laws said it only applies to Black people, but overwhelmingly, they were only enforced against Black people. And many, many times, thousands of times, I believe, you had young Black men who attempted to do that. They ended up being arrested and returned to the original farmer where they worked in chains, not even as a free worker, but as a slave.
And the result, as you write, thousands of Black men were arrested, charged with whatever, jailed, and then sold to plantations, railroads, mills, lumber camps, and factories in the Deep South. And this went on, you say, right up to World War II.
And it was everywhere in the South. These forced labor camps were all over the place. And the records that still survive, buried in courthouses all over the South, make it abundantly clear that thousands and thousands of African Americans were arrested on completely specious claims, made up stuff, and then purely because of this economic need and the ability of sheriffs and constables and others to make money off arresting them and then providing them to these commercial enterprises and being paid for that.
You have a photograph in here. I have literally not been able to get this photograph out of my mind since I saw it the first time several weeks ago when I first got your book. It's a photograph of an unnamed prisoner tied around a pickaxe for punishment in a Georgia labor camp. It was photographed sometime around 1932, which, and this is hard to believe, was 2 years before I was born.
Well, that picture was taken by a journalist named John Spivak, who took an astonishing series of pictures in these forced labor camps in Georgia in the 1930s. He got access to the prison system of Georgia and these forced labor encampments, which were scattered all over the place. Some of them were way out in the deep woods. There were turpentine camps. Some of them were mining camps, all incredibly harsh, brutal work. He got access to these as a journalist, in part because the officials of Georgia had no particular shame in what was happening.
That's the surprising thing.
Well, but what the picture also demonstrates was the level of violence and brutality, the venality of things that were done. And so this kind of physical torture went on a huge scale. People were whipped, starved. They went without clothing. There were work camps where people reported that they would arrive looking for a lost family member, and they would arrive at a sawmill or a lumber camp where the men were working as slaves, naked, chained, whipped. It was just astonishing, the level of brutality.
Yeah. You have a story in here of a young man a late teenager, who spilled or poured coffee on the hog of the farmer he was working for. He was stripped, stretched across a barrel, and flogged 69 times with a leather strap, and he died a week later. But that's not a unique story in this book.
No, that was incredibly common, and there were thousands and thousands of people who died under these circumstances over the span of the period that I write about in the book. And over again, it was from disease and malnutrition and from outright homicide and physical abuse.
You give voice to a young man long dead, whose voice would never have been heard had you not discovered it, resurrected it, and presented it. He's the chief character in this book. Green Cottenham, is that it? Yes.
That's right.
Tell me about Green Cottenham.
Green Cottenham was a man who was born in the 1880s to a mother and a father both of whom had been slaves, who were emancipated at the end of the Civil War. Imagine a young man and a young woman who've just been freed from slavery, and now they have the opportunity to break away from the plantations where they'd been held, begin a new life, and so they do. They marry, they have many children. Green Cottenham is the last of them. He's born in the 1880s, just as this terrible curtain of hostility and oppression is beginning to really creep across all of black life in the South. And by the time he becomes an adult, in the first years of the 20th century, the worst forces of the efforts to re-enslave black Americans are in full power across the South. And in the North, the allies, the white allies of the freed slaves, have abandoned them. And so right at the beginning of the 20th century, whites all across America have essentially reached this new consensus that slavery shouldn't be brought back, but if African Americans are returned to a state of absolute servility, that's okay. And Green Cottenham becomes an adult at exactly that moment. And then in 1908, in the spring of 1908, he's arrested, standing outside a train station in a little town in Alabama. The officer who arrests him couldn't remember what the charge was by the time he brought him in front of the judge, so he's conveniently convicted of a different crime than the one he was originally picked up for. He ends up being sold 3 days later with another group of black men into a coal mine outside of Birmingham, and he survives there several months and then dies under terrible circumstances.